All right, here we go. Uh, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Benson Anay, who is Professor of Philosophy and BOF Research Professor at the Center for Philosophical Psychology at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Benson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's a great series. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you. So we're talking about the book that you collaborated on with Dominic Lopez and Nick Riggle, called Aesthetic Life and Why It Matters, which came out this year, 2022, from Oxford University Press. And I really enjoy this book. I think it'll be a great book for introduction to aesthetics or philosophy of art. And I also think it'd be great, for an aesthetics unit or a philosophy of art unit in just like an intro to philosophy course. So I think there's a lot of benefits to be had with this book
Are you going to
pedagogically.
teach it?
I'm planning to at some point. Yeah. Just a question
Very
of,
big answer.
yeah, I know. Um, and so your chapter on the book is on aesthetic experience, and this is something you've written a lot about throughout your career in philosophical aesthetics or just philosophy in general. And it's also something you talk about in your book, Aesthetics, A Very Short Introduction, also from Oxford University Press from 2 years ago in 2020. I think maybe the place to start is the discussion is maybe where we disagree, which is on the emphasis we should place in aesthetics on experience versus judgment. You want to say that experience is the fundamental thing that we working in aesthetics should be focusing on, whereas a lot of people, myself included, want to say, no, judgment's important. I don't think I want to go like whole hog with judgment and say, no, judgment's the most important thing because historically it has been yada, yada, yada. I just think it's, more central than maybe you take it to be. And so I guess just as a first question, why are you so down on judgment?
I don't know. I don't enjoy judging. I'm not judgy. So the way I remember that chapter is that what I do is that I try to answer the question. Uh, the title of the book is Aesthetic Life and Why It Matters, and I guess my question is, why do we care so much about the aesthetic domain? And so I guess the initial observation is that we just spend a lot of time doing aesthetic stuff that we could do doing other things, like, I don't know, making money or doing sports, whatever. And also we spend a lot of money. So why do we do that? What would explain? And I go through a bunch of explanations that people have been giving within philosophy or outside philosophy, and try to dismiss them. And one of them, which I think is the most influential view within philosophy, is that we care about the aesthetic domain because we care about aesthetic judgments, and we care about getting our aesthetic judgments right. We care about correct aesthetic judgments. And I just don't think that's why we do that. That's why we spend all this time and money on aesthetic stuff. I think we do it because in order to get to undergo rewarding and nice positive experiences, which go under the rubric of aesthetic experiences. So I think that's where we disagree. And then you wrote a very nice review of my very short introduction, where we also expressed this disagreement. So maybe you should iron this out today. That'll be fun.
Yeah, let's iron it out. So, my view, I think, basically is that a large part of why we engage with aesthetic objects or seek out aesthetic experiences is to collaborate with other people on them, and not merely in terms of experiencing them together, although I think that's absolutely important and really a central part of our aesthetic lives. I mean, I have an article called Shared Musical Experiences where I argue exactly that. But I think part of it too is I want to share my experiences with others, not merely in the moment, but also after the fact. And we do that by talking about them and thinking through them together and sharing views and opinions and judgments, and agreeing and especially disagreeing with other people. And that's a way of sharpening our own sense of what matters to us in aesthetic life and what certain values we have aesthetically. And it's also helping us to have better experiences moving forward, right? If you know, I hear a piece of jazz and you've heard it before and we talk about it, you can make me aware of things in the piece that I wasn't aware of. And so when I go back to listen to it again, right, this is largely going to be true of recordings rather than live performances, at least of jazz. But when I go back and listen to it again, I'm going to be able to, you know, have a better heightened experience or a deeper, richer experience than I would have without talking with you about it. And so I'm guessing you agree with that.
Yeah, but that is what you were just saying, is that you know, at the end of the day, what matters is that later on you're going to have a better, more rewarding experience. So I'm not sure that we really disagree that much. So I mean, when I talk about experiences or aesthetic experiences, and also experiences in general, it's fairly clear in, you know, philosophy of perception that perceptual experiences and aesthetic experiences, whether they're perceptual or not, they're very much subject to various top-down influences. So various judgments that you might make. Really where the action is not the judgment that influences the aesthetic experience, but it's the aesthetic experience itself. And I guess the example that I use is that, you know, if you're in front of a painting and or I don't know, you go to a concert and you can't make up your mind. I mean, sometimes you love it, sometimes you hate it. You can't make it informed judgment. But it doesn't make your, you know, 2-hour experience any less rewarding or any less fun. So I think that, I mean, part of me thinks that the whole judgment talk is a bit of a red herring. Now, what you're saying about, you know, I think it's a really good and important point that you're saying that, well, aesthetic engagement doesn't stop when the music stops, as it were, right? So afterwards, you know, you come out of the concert and you sit down and in the bar and you talk about it. But what's happening there, I don't think is about, you know, exchanging judgments. What's happening there, that's my view, is that you're doing some kind of shared remembering. So there's the shared experiencing at the concert, which you're talking about, and which I really care about. I think that's like a really important aspect of the social aspect of aesthetics, or the social dimensions of aesthetics. But when we're talking about art, when we're talking about various aesthetic phenomena or aesthetic domain, often what happens there is that we're reliving our experiences together. Often we experience those things together to begin with, and now we're remembering experiencing them together. But it also happens that, you know, you saw a film in Illinois in a cinema, and I saw it in Belgium, and then we talk about it and we're remembering. We did not experience it together, but when we're remembering together, that still can somehow bring us together in that way. So that's also about experiences, in my view.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, maybe we agree a lot more
I know.
at least I thought we did.
Make it for a boring conversation.
I know, right? But what about and this is something I talked about with Dom Lopez when I interviewed him, which that'll be the video before this one, which isn't out yet, so you haven't seen it yet. But one of the things he and I talked about, at least briefly, was the phenomenon of trying to rank aesthetic objects. And so, you know, he views you know, in his chapter, he talks about how aesthetic values between aesthetic communities are incommensurable, in that, you know, if I'm a heavy metal fan and you're not, you can't criticize, you know, the values of my community, or say that you're necessarily better than me because, you know, you're a disco fan or whatever. But within aesthetic communities, right, within, say, you know, David Bowie fans or heavy metal fans or folk music fans or Thai cuisine fans or jazz aficionados, whatever, you know, sometimes we engage in ranking albums or ranking songs or ranking artists with one another, and, you know, those can go poorly, right? But they can also be really fun and really give like insight into each other's individuality and maybe help influence how we think about these albums. Do you have thoughts on ranking? Because that does seem to be fundamentally about judging, right, the objects.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a very surface of any kind of aesthetic agreement and disagreement. And I mean, that does happen on social media a fair amount, right? Ranking, I don't know, your favorite Godard films, not that Godard and stuff. And then sometimes you just see the other people's ranking and say, what the hell? I thought that I have a similar taste as this person, and it just doesn't make sense. but I think that that's partly because that's just the ranking is extremely coarse grained, right? You don't have you can't explain why is it that you like this piece or what aspect of it you like about it. So I'm not a fan of the whole ranking thing. And film critics do that a lot when they 10 best movies of 2022, and I'm not sure that that's the most valuable of our aesthetic activities is the ranking thing. But I mean, one thing that you mentioned at the beginning of this question, I think, is really important, namely that the whole ranking thing only makes sense within a certain relatively narrow thing. So if I'm going to rank the best music ever produced, that makes no sense, and you rank the best music ever produced. So what it would make sense is to have, if both of us we share a musical taste, and then we rank a relatively, but maybe I don't know, the best David Bowie albums, and that might be a little more informative. But even there, I think there's just a lot of things that are underspecified. What it is that you like about that album compared to what contrast class.
Yeah, and I think with rankings too, they're only good insofar as they prompt further discussion and conversation and debate and agreement and disagreement. That, yeah, just the mere act of here's my top 10 David Bowie albums and then here's yours, and oh, I thought we had the same taste. Why are you putting low so high? Right.
And right.
Yeah.
And the other way around, right? I mean, it's possible that I have the same ranking as you, but I just that's not the reason why I put this as the first album is not the same as yours. So I feel that that's just like a stupidly coarse grain and kind of uninformatively coarse grain way of exchanging aesthetic ideas. So I don't really do that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So maybe we should talk about aesthetic experience, right? The really hard problem in aesthetics is what aesthetic experience is. And you've published a lot on that question. And so maybe we could just get into the weeds a bit into your view of what's involved in aesthetic experience and then why it's so fundamental, I think, based on that.
Yeah, so my main view, so I'm an esthetician. I like to think of myself as doing aesthetics. I'm also a philosopher of mind, a philosopher of perception. And I feel that aesthetic experience is a kind of experience. So philosophy of perception has a lot to say about that. So I'm trying to use the conceptual apparatus of philosophy of perception to gain more insights about what's the difference between aesthetic experiences and non-aesthetic experiences. The first thing I want to say about this is so aesthetic experience is just kind of a heavy term, and people kind of tend to think of this extremely strong experiences, and I don't have that view. I think that you can have extremely minor aesthetic experiences when you look in the mirror and you see that your tie needs strengthening, straightening, and so you straighten your tie. That's an aesthetic experience. Or your cravat is too out, so I'm just going to do that. That's an aesthetic experience, right? So you act on it. So I don't want to. So I think because of this, we have extremely many aesthetic experiences every hour. Much of them not very strong, and sometimes it is a very strong experience. And I have the various accounts of aesthetic experience. I don't know where you want me to start. I have this big thing that got somewhat picked up in various circles of academia about distributed attention. So I want to say that aesthetic experience is characterized by the way we exercise our attention. So our attention is at the same time both distributed and focused. It's focused on one object and distributed across various properties of that object in this kind of open-ended manner. So that's the view. And when I gave that view, I was trying to be clear about how that's supposed to be culturally a very specific experience, something that was very influential in the 20th century and the 19th century in the West. And it's not gonna capture all aesthetic experiences anywhere in the world in all historical periods. And that's something that I'm really interested in. In fact, that's my big next project. Is a book called Global Aesthetics, where I'm going to try to look at non-Western aesthetics and also how there are cross-cultural variations in aesthetic engagements. So I very much care about that issue. So that was supposed to be just one culturally specific but very influential account of aesthetic experience. And I was trying to give a more wide scope account of aesthetic experience in this book that you reviewed, the very short introduction, where I say that when what's happening in aesthetic experience is that you're attending both the object and your experience of the object, especially the relation between the two. So you're attending to how this object hits you. And that might be, the distributed attention stuff is a special case of that. But there's more other cases. So I'm trying to go a little bit wider, and so I'm trying to capture some less specific aesthetic experiences as well. And I have a as yet unpublished or not even close to being published account where I'm trying to characterize aesthetic experience as an action, an interaction with the object. I don't know whether we're ready to talk about that, but that's, I guess it's what I'm most interested in, because it's not stuff that I've already done, but something that I'm gonna do in the future. So,
yeah. And so one thing that you said that I think is really important to all three chapters, your chapter, Dom's chapter, and Nick's chapter, and Aesthetic Life and Why It Matters, is the idea that we're having aesthetic experiences all the time, right? That they're, the way of, classically thinking about them in at least the Western tradition is, like the Kantian, mode of, there's the experience of beauty and there's the experience of the sublime, and these are these big grand things. Or, skipping ahead a few generations, you have John Dewey, and the aesthetic is an experience. These are these really big, important, palpable things that we judge all the other experiences we have by. And yet the aesthetic is part of everyday life. And as you said, it's just, you look in the mirror and you say, oh, I have a hair in the wrong place, or my tie is not straight, or oh, I look good right now. Or, just various sorts of, minor things of, the water feels cool and I enjoy that, right, as it hits my tongue, et cetera, right? That these things are happening all the time. And, any account of the aesthetic needs to be able to account for not just these big, grand, relatively isolated sorts of experiences, but more the pervasive nature of the aesthetic in our everyday lives. And I think you all do a good job in the book of capturing that. So do you have further thoughts on just the everydayness, the ordinariness of these like more low level experiences?
So I mean, one thing that we did not actually emphasize in the book, but how in the philosophy of various art forms, back in the 19th century, people were talking about the masterpieces only. And then in the 20th century, eventually we figured out that if you focus only on the masterpiece, then you're going to miss out on a lot of really important things. So what we should do is to look at the whole corpus, including the really mediocre things. And that's why we're going to be able to figure out what are the stylistic norms that the masterpieces are reacting against. So in the same way, if you're only kind of focusing on the peaks of aesthetic experience, then you're going to miss out on a lot of like the really important things that characterizes aesthetic experience. So I think there's a nice kind of analogy between the art and the aesthetic domain here, which otherwise I'm trying to keep separate. So that's a key thought. I also think of the whole the everyday aesthetic experience. That's a really important theme in non-European aesthetics, especially Japanese aesthetics, but also in basically any other non-Western, non-European aesthetics, aesthetic traditions. The Yoruba aesthetics is very big on that, and the Raza, the South Asian, or I guess South Asian / Indonesian / East African tradition, and I feel that the general obsession with peak aesthetic experiences is a Western thing. So is the obsession with aesthetic judgments. I would then go back to our little snarkily to our initial disagreement.
Let's bring that back. That other cultures very much are less about judgments, even though clearly judgments are being made. It's the experience itself. And especially, one thing that you talk about in the chapter that I think is really important is that those experiences are almost always socially embedded. Whereas within the Western tradition, there's an emphasis on the individual experience and what's happening, to us. Whereas in other cultures, it's, almost every other culture, how it's conceived of is, no, us, that our experiences of art or our experiences of music, our experiences of painting, these are communal sorts of things that we're doing together. And so maybe that relates to your idea of aesthetic experience as being an action, right? That, these experiences we're having are things we're doing together with other people in a community setting.
Well, so the action stuff. Should we talk about that? I think it's
Yeah,
a. I
sure.
think I think it's it's nicely tied into this the stuff that we're talking about. So there's again kind of a grand tradition, again in very much Western aesthetics, that aesthetic engagement is cut off from action. Kantian stuff. And I want to say that that's not. First of all, that's very atypical if you look at the whole aesthetic landscape across the world. In most aesthetic traditions, action is extremely important. But also, it's if you look at just how we are engaging with artworks, I think that we very often perform intentional actions when we're having aesthetic experience. So in philosophy of action, we make a distinction between non-intentional and intentional actions. Non-intentional action is when you're gesticulating. You didn't kind of plan to do that. You just somehow move your hands. But we often do deliberate intentional actions when we're having aesthetic experiences, partly in order to maintain the aesthetic experience, and partly to somehow to get there, right? So it's a kind of a nice analogy with emotional experiences. So often in emotional experiences, you also are intentionally trying to regulate your emotional experiences. So my standard example is when you're at a funeral and it's someone who you really care about, but you don't feel that you're sad. You're sad, but you're not sad enough. You should be sad. You should be, sadder. It's and you're trying to intentionally put yourself in a frame of mind when you're more sad. And I think the same thing happens in aesthetic experiences. You're at the concert of your favorite band, and you paid a lot of money for this, and I was waiting for, I bought the ticket, I don't know, 2 years ago, and you're waiting for a long time, counting the days, and you're just not, I don't know, you're not feeling it. Then you're making an effort, right? You're trying to get in that somehow frame of mind. So I think that is a really important aspect of aesthetic engagement that kind of goes unnoticed. And also, I feel, to go back to the social dimensions, which is where we're coming from, when we're engaging together, in some sense, it's some kind of a joint effort that's happening, and I think that's a really nice social bond between people. I guess I do talk about all of this in that chapter, didn't I?
Yeah, that in a sense we're helping each other get there, or we're getting in each other's way, right? The drunk guy at the concert in front of you who's being too loud, right, is putting up an obstacle to your ability to get to the heightened aesthetic state that you're trying to get to, or at least the pleasurable one.
Well, it's a kind of it's a triangulation thing, right? I mean, I'm engaging with this thing, you're engaging with this thing, and I'm engaging with you. So there's good. I mean, you're kind of helping it. You can help each other, or kind of prevent each other from getting there. But there's always this kind of three-sided dynamics to that engagement and if there's more than two people, then obviously an even more sided engagement. Yeah.
Yeah. And so do you have further thoughts on the social side or the community side of aesthetic experience?
Yeah, so again, in this new work that I'm doing in global aesthetics, I'm trying to identify, I think, 8 concept or premises that basically Western aesthetics is completely atypical in the world, and one of them is the social dimension. So I think that there's no other aesthetic tradition that ignores the social, the essential nature of the social aspect of aesthetic engagement. But that is not to say that in Western aesthetics there's no talk of social dimensions. For example, the whole aesthetic agreement disagreement stuff, in some sense, that's about the social aspects, right? It's about communicating about aesthetic stuff. But in some sense, it's not really a constitutive part of aesthetic engagement that it's social. I'm engaging by myself here with this artwork, and you by yourself in that artwork, and afterwards we talk about it and agreeing or disagreeing. But the engagement itself is not necessarily a social, and it has anything, doesn't have anything social as a constitutive part. Whereas I think all other aesthetic traditions, the social just plays such an important constitutive role that makes the Western tradition a little less representative than we might think. Yeah. So that I think is an important thing to push against, and I think that's actually what's happening in very much Western aesthetics is a push against that tradition. So funnily enough, that goes in a direction that's kind of further away from Western aesthetic and closer to other aesthetic traditions. But recently, in the last 10 or something years, there's been so much on the social aspect of aesthetic engagement, which is great.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me as you were talking just now is that you're talking about how the social is in some way constitutive of the aesthetic or of aesthetic experience. And as you mentioned earlier, how at least in aesthetics, a very short introduction, the account you're giving there is we're attending not just to the object or its aesthetic properties, but we're attending to the object and its relation to us. Right. When you're doing it with other people, could there be a sense in which you're attending to the object and its relation to us, not as individuals, but collectively, the way in which you're shaping how I experience the thing, and I'm shaping how you're experiencing, we're experiencing it together as a joint action or activity?
I don't know. That sounds a little Kantian to me. So the whole thing that you're standing in for humanity there or something like that. And I actually, so I was talking about these 8 or so premises or key concepts that Western aesthetics is alone with. And one of them, I believe, is intersubjective normativity.
Yeah.
So that's the general Kantian idea that if I have a certain aesthetic experience, then I somehow tacitly assume that any human should have a similar kind of experience or some such thing. And there's a lot of debates about what is actually said there. So I think that there's a kind of, in some sense, the social aspect is put in the wrong place in the Western tradition, or maybe I shouldn't say it the wrong way, but put in a way that's very atypical compared to the other aesthetic traditions. So it's put in this kind of in the normativity of the engagement, rather than just the actual what it is to engage, right? And again, if you look at any of the other traditions, that there is normativity there's always some form of normativity in about aesthetic engagements in all aesthetic traditions, but it's very, very rarely it's some kind of intersubjective normativity that's supposed to somehow generalize to. So there's less of a kind of demand on other people about what they should do. This is how you should engage.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to go Kantian there. I think I just articulated my question poorly, but it's if you and I are watching a movie together, or you and I are looking at a painting together, or listening to a song together, right? And maybe there are multiple other people engaged there. Not the sense that I'm standing in for all of humanity, but the sense in which we're collaboratively engaging with this object. And so it's not merely the relationship between the object and me, but it's the relationship between the object and us, those of us in the room with the object.
Exactly. No, that's absolutely right.
Good,
and I think that's the sense in which I think that and that's part of the reason why I really care about the experience and not the judgment, because that's the experiencing together is just something that creates such a bond that debating rankings of best albums is never going to be able to do that, because there's this kind of very small adjustments that you do. You draw your friend's attention to this aspect or that aspect, and there's this kind of little dance that's going on with little adjustments from you, adjustments from me, and that is really a form of interaction between two people that exchanging rankings it's not going to be able to achieve. To go back to that.
Yeah, good. So yeah, I think we do agree a lot more than I thought we did. So that's nice. That's something, right?
Yeah, I thought there's gonna be more.
Yeah, I mean, maybe get us in a room together and that would happen, but at least over Zoom.
Yeah, you gotta keep some civility.
Yeah, we're getting along swimmingly. Awesome. Do you have any further thoughts or points that you want to discuss before we finish this thing off?
I don't know about what? About judgments or
Yeah, judgments or experience or the social
yeah, why
side
do you
of.
care so much about judgments? What's so good about judging? I talked enough. Now you should talk.
No, no, no. I'm a very judgmental person. Like, no, 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 no. No, I mean, I do conceive of, the role of judgment is, not the Kantian sense of the whole point of this is to form judgments that somehow like are expressive of our like highest human possibilities or something of that sort. Rather, it is like the collaborative side of it. It is the being a part of a community with other people, especially if they're, not, it's not like a local community, but it's a dispersed one, that you engage with people, over the internet and stuff, that, that engagement is going to have to happen at the level of sharing judgments with one another, by and large. And because of the dispersion of communities, or at least some communities, that's just how it's going to have to go. But it very much is, expressing our individuality and expressing our sense of belonging with one another through this collaborative act of sharing judgments with one another and shaping each other's judgments and shaping each other's, or rather refining each other's ability to judge and thus to experience, which, maybe it is ultimately pointing at having better experiences. In that case, we agree with one another, but I don't know.
No, that is actually really interesting. So it's the similarity of judgment that creates the communities.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea, right? Oh, that sounds right. That sounds exactly right. But in some sense, it's just the starting point, right? I mean, the fun part starts after that. Once you have
Yeah.
an community, and once you somehow start sharing. But you're right. That's a kind of a necessary step to know who you should be sharing with. On the other hand, I mean, often you're going out of your comfort zone, right? I mean, you go to a concert with a girl because you want to impress her, not because you like the music, and then you might just encounter something that you like, and that can be as rewarding a shared aesthetic experience as one that you have with your I don't know, Facebook group of some weird esoteric musical group that you're discussing day and night. So I can see that that's an important thing, but again, I'm not sure that that's going to be the make or break or aesthetic engagement.
Yeah, no, you're right that we very much can go sort of afield, or things can just hit us unexpectedly that are, outside of our aesthetic comfort zones, or, outside of our backgrounds or common interests, right? That, oh, I never really paid attention to yodeling, but that kind of sounds cool, right? I mean, I've had that experience with yodeling in particular. Like,
Really?
I've had no background or real interest in yodeling, and then like some random YouTube video popped up and it was yodeling, and I was like, wow, what's going on here? Right. And so then I started to get like, you know, like a minor in yodeling.
Can
I mean, I'm
you
not like super into it, but like, yeah, there's
can you yodel?
no. I'm not, no.
Try. I think the viewers of this podcast would love to hear you yodel. Am I right, fella?
Yeah, we'll get a poll going, and maybe in a future
Hit a
video.
like if you want. If you want.
Yeah, hit like if you want me to yodel. Yeah, I need to, do all sorts of training, I think, to be able to make my voice do anything resembling yodeling.
I mean, I think that the whole going so if you only did stuff that is together with other people who we kind of know to be our aesthetic peers on the basis of shared judgments, then we wouldn't really do much. So I like 60s black and white slow films, and the reason for that, triggering cause, I guess, as Jutsky would say, is that when I was 15 or 16 or something, I went to the cinema because of with a girl, but I didn't want to see that film. It was Antonioni film. She wanted to see it, and I went along because, you know, wanted to all seem sophisticated and stuff. And you know, she wanted to go, I'm gonna go. And it was amazing. So and I would I would not have done that if I were just following things that I would have done with my aesthetic peers, because my aesthetic peers at that point were people who were into Beverly Hills Cop. So that's a different so I feel that that's important, that again kind of at one point for aesthetic experience and one point against aesthetic judgment based groups.
Yeah. I'm still into Beverly Hills Cop, by the way.
Oh, so am I.
Yeah.
Who isn't?
Exactly. What sort of person isn't into Beverly Hills Cop? I think on that shared note of sharing judgments that overlap with one another and align with one another, I think we should end it there. So Benza, thank you so much for doing this. This was really fun. I've been looking forward to it for a while.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. That was great fun.